Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage, where myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer, and Mike Hutchinson, another games designer, have chats about designing miniatures games, ideally designing better miniatures games. So today we're going to have a quick chat about something relatively specific, and it's activation advantage in games. So we've had a conversation previously about activation systems and initiative systems and how they work and what they are. It has popped up in the comments section, and it is obviously a quite major part about in relation to activation systems is activation advantage. So what we mean by activation advantage and why it is a problem for games is that there are, let's say, tactical choices and maybe strategic choices in relation to games, and there are tactically interesting choices and tactically uninteresting choices. One thing that is a tactically uninteresting choice or loop within a game is, what is the biggest threat to me? What is the best thing with dealing with that threat? Apply A to B and just doing that. Because that can reduce the whole game into just a set of two priority lists that you mangle into each other and just go down one step at a time. I use my biggest hammer on the most threatening nut and repeat until nut is crushed and then move on to second nut. Now, if you have a game with alternating activations, it can be a situation where the whole game tactically is just a repeat of that process.
Mm-hmm.
And then if one player has more activations than the other player, you both go through that process until the person who has the more activations gets to play the game and engage with it and do strategically interesting things and achieve objectives and think and enjoy the puzzle and sort of really get into it. And so it can mean that those games end up being about who achieves activation advantage strategically. Once you achieve activation advantage, you pretty much win the game because you're then steering the whole game, outside of the very mechanical process. And you're also the only guy who's really having the full fun of the game as you play it. And so a lot of games have gone into trying to remove activation advantage. A lot of alternating activation systems are about fudging that sort of tactical payoff of options, not allowing you to pick any old model whenever you activate, messing with when you get to activate them, how many times you get to activate them, etc., etc. It's a big problem. It's potentially a huge problem for the fun and interest and balance of game. And how do you deal with it? What you do about it? How do you engage with it?
And so in my mind, activation advantage tends to manifest as the interaction between an alternating activation turn structure and the most natural thing in the world, which is models or units are a depleting resource over time. And also add to that, like, the game expects forces to be of different sizes. Like it's natural to have 3 big hero dudes versus 12 little scrubby goblins or whatever. And so different different force sizes and depleting resources, I think naturally leads to this. Is that right? Do you agree that this is basically a problem for alternating activation systems and doesn't really occur in what we call I go, you go systems?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, looking at
other than the first turn advantage thing, which we've discussed elsewhere, I think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I go, you go systems have first turn iters. That's their problem. That's their sort of original sin. They allow for way more sort of strategic thinking in relation to a turn, because I can genuinely plan this unit's position in relation to that unit's position and know that they're both going to be where I want them to be before I activate them for their shooting. So I can actually plan across my whole force as a single thing and think strategically and position, etc., in a way that I can't with alternating activation. So yeah, I do think that this is not a thing that is such a big problem in relation to I Go, You Go. And yeah, I've literally sort of scribbled that down in my notes, and I've literally also scribbled down in my notes that one of the big issues is when you have asymmetrical forces where if the goblins and the knights, are inherently balanced as forces, and there's loads and loads of goblins and very few knights, then, activation advantage and just the basic use of objectives within your game instantly powers the goblins up a couple of notches over the knights, because it might take 5 goblins to take down a knight, but it only takes 1 goblin to achieve the given objective. And certainly once 1 goblin is activated and 1 knight's activated and 1 goblin and so on down, and then 1 guy's got 20 more goblins to activate, that's just a massive advantage, because you then get to choose where you apply force, where you apply pressure. And if it's a straight up that 5 goblins can take down 1 knight, then the goblins will win because of all those advantages. And yeah, balancing out and figuring those out is a big and really tricky deal.
Yeah, and I think one of the natural assumptions, although games have messed around with this, is that each model gets an activation, and so the pool of activations is essentially equivalent to the pool of models. You can mess around with that by saying, well, maybe we both get 5 activations, and so if I've got 3 models, one or two of them are going to get to Rambo around a couple times, and if you've got 12, you're going to have to choose where you activate, but you've got more choice. You've spread out a bunch of options, so you've got optionality, whereas I've got I've got guaranteed to activate everything that I've paid points for.
Yeah, and yeah, there are a few, I'm genuinely not sure what a strong fix for this is, and I think that one of the big fixes for it arguably is some sort of hybrid system. We've spoken before about a lot of the pain of I Go, You Go or alternating activation can be sort of solved by an I Go, You Go alternating activation. So we do our movement alternating, and then we do all our shooting alternating, and then we do all our combat alternating. So it's a sort of hybrid rather than I activate a thing that does all of its stuff and then activate the next.
Right, because one of the key frustrations, I think, is it's very much what you were talking about, not being able to organize multiple of your elements to coordinate into a certain plan, because because of this effect that you were talking about, where if I need my 2 guys to work together, I will move my first guy and he'll get eliminated by something powerful that's a good counter to it, and then I get to move up this other one, but it's too late and now I have to choose something else. So some games provide sort of group activations or pack activations. You get that in Malifaux, you get that in Frostgrave, and that allows a little you get that in Infinity as well. That allows a little cluster of models to act as a combined force. I think that's an all right solution, but it certainly means that it certainly doesn't quite get over this problem where it's like, well, as soon as I make the first of my 3 moves to construct a strategy, you will just go in with the snippers and clip that person's head off.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of allowing a model to make a full activation before another model does anything does have that sort of alpha strike problem, where it's like, okay, so you've got your very powerful character with an enormous great big samurai sword, and they run up and they just hack the head off of one of my characters before it gets to do anything. Well, maybe your character moves, and then my character doesn't just stand there going, oh, my head's coming off soon. Maybe my guy can just walk off. Maybe we all move, and if you've just piled into one person who you horribly outclass, they just go, I'm leaving. I'm obviously leaving. I might be running screaming as I leave, but I'm definitely leaving. And then those 2 guys over there can come in and replace me, and we can have more of a sort of balance.
Yeah, and another solution to that activation problem is the solution that we talked about during some of the Hobgoblin design chats, where things that are killed are not removed immediately but are removed at the end of the turn. It doesn't fix the sort of ganging up goblins problem. And I think that very asymmetrical forces asks a really big question about, is there ever anything better than more activations? Because more activations in an alternating activation game allows me to move things that don't matter, force you to move the things that you have, therefore committing your entire force, and then I can move the things that are important to me. Like that's why lists with summoning or lists with lots of small creatures can be so powerful, because in a goblin army I can move all the pointless goblins that don't matter that all cost 4 points, and then after you've moved everything and I know absolutely everything that you could possibly do in that turn, then comes in the goblin, the orc war boss and the unit of trolls, and you can't say a dang thing about it.
Yeah. Activation advantage is the equivalent of card advantage in TCGs and things like that, where it's like arguably nothing is better than card advantage in a lot of those games, and arguably nothing is better than activation advantage in sort of certainly solo minis miniatures games,
Right. And so the natural balancing factor of like, well, my goblins are rubbish and your like turbo knights are amazing, it eliminates the fact that I don't get to make choices with those knights which are in any way sensible, because I'm always lacking information about where the important pressure points on the board are going to be, because you have yet to commit your forces. And so I think, maybe there's an element there which is equivalent to the sort of pilot skill thing. Like maybe the more a unit matters because it's a war boss or a unit of trolls, the more it has to move first in order to like. I mean, it's an arbitrary forcing function. I don't like it even as I'm saying it out loud, but like maybe the rubbish units have to move last because that's just cheating.
Yeah, I think there are 3 fixes. Other than, and I think a lot of the pain comes off if you do have alternating activation within phases. But I think the 3 fixes, 2 of which are very, very quick, and 1 of which is a bit bigger and sort of more usual. One of the first ones is allowing a number of passes
Right.
to each force. Super simple, really easy. And what at the start of the game, you count up number of activations each side would have per turn, and whoever has the fewest activations has a little stack of pass tokens or pass goes, and they can pass. And so it basically means that the knights can stand there while the goblins run around ineffectually wanging at their armor and poking various objectives. And when the goblins have finished mucking about, the knights go, right, now it's 1 activation each, and so you can't just punch the objective 5 times, because I can walk over, kick your head off, and knock the objective.
Yeah, and that passes system allows, if it's important for me to move fast to capture some objective, I can choose to do that and then pass, and then come in with my guns. Or if I want to wait to see where you're at, then I can pass. It's a good fix. You can see it in Ash Barker's Gamma Wolves. He does exactly that solution in there.
Yep, it's super quick. It's very low effort, and it eases off a lot of these problems immediately. The second one I think is related to that is, as you're saying, is not have things taken off until the end of the turn, because it cuts out the alpha strike of someone just literally punching someone to death. And the third one, and I think it's one that requires a bit more design, and it's one that you see defining out the differences between a lot of these sorts of games, and it's engaging in some sort of system that obscures the activation order amongst your units.
Right, the dice bag system from the Warlord games.
Yeah, or the card-based system for something like Dracula's America.
Or drop zone, drop fleet commander.
And there's loads and loads of these sorts of games. I think particularly the smaller skirmish games very often are looking very hard into ways of messing with what units you get to activate, what order you're allowed to activate in them, reducing your control over that or increasing your resource investment into it in order to deal with activation advantage.
I think there's a fifth one that's used somewhat regularly as well, which you see in stuff like Song of Blades and whatchamacallit. And in this is not a test as well, which is using an uncertain activation system or a turnover system where yes, you might have more goblins, but we're both going to have to be testing to see whether our units actually activate, and if we fail, then there's a turnover, and then it goes to the other person's ability to activate. So it's not quite an alternating activation system. It's sort of a push your luck. Let me see if I can get the things that matter to move before the turn flips over and you get a chance to do the same, and then it flips back. That I think that's quite a stylistic choice. Lots of people like that. I happen not to, but I think it's a way of introducing a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability, and therefore it sort of takes the activation advantage problem and turns it into it's less boring because it's less predictable. You can decide whether it's more fun because it's less predictable, but it's certainly less boring.
Yeah, I mean, and this is one of the things, okay, and this is more of an opinion than a fact, but I feel like alternating activation, and particularly asymmetrical forces alternating activation, feels like it's more sort of tactical than I go, you go, because it says, okay, look, at the top of the turn, you've got to make this really important choice. You've got to choose which of all of your models get to go first, and then we go back and forth. And that's really tactical and really engaging, and you've got to figure out what his plans are and prioritize your plans, and that's a really tactical choice. Whereas on your I go, you go, it's like, well, you get to activate your whole army, so who cares which unit you activate first? You're going to do all of them. Increasingly, I'm not sure that's actually an interesting and effective tactical choice, because it's so important which one you activate first. There's a glaring siren usually going off on the tabletop going, deal with this, deal with this, deal with this. And so there's no real choice for me. It's like, I'm obviously going to do that thing first. You know, a couple of times there's a coin flip. But most of the time.
And the other thing is that because the alternating activations creates a very dynamic situation, what you are making a judgment on, even though you're prioritizing your whole turn and figuring out what you're going to do, what the other guy's going to do, and so forth, like you're only able to make a judgment partially in that moment based on the board state, and then you make your first activation, and then he does, and now the board state's different, and now I need to reprioritize everything. And so actually, it's very tactical, it's very in the moment, it's very transitory. Like the decisions that you're having to make are very urgent and keep slipping away from you. And so potentially the sweep of a move all of your forces, like there's a more strategic element to that, because you can see a strategic sweep, you can see all the positions of everything, you can make a number of moves towards a strategy, executing your tactics this turn, and you didn't have to constantly recompute. And I think that's one of the reasons that alternating activation games, when they're played at high levels, can feel so stressful, because you have to do a really deep situational analysis every 4 or 5 minutes because the situation changed.
Alternating activation is definitely very tactical as opposed to very strategic. I'm increasingly not sure that it's actually
even that tactical, right? Yeah, because you end up making a quite limited decision where the outcome is somewhat obvious, and then you have to make another limited decision where the outcome is equally quite obvious. And so actually, as it plays out over the turn, you made a series of fairly obvious decisions of, well, clearly I have to move this thing, clearly I have to move this thing, clearly I have to move this thing, and then I have to mop up at the end of the turn, and it doesn't really matter what order I do those things, I knew I was going to do them.
It's like, would you rather be hit in the head by a sledgehammer or a banana is a tactical choice. It's not a strategic choice, but that's not a choice. That's not an actual choice.
I mean, I think the other side of it, or the place where it is working, or it does work nicely, is if there are enough jobs to do, and the obvious looking thing is that, like, ogre needs to kick king in the head, but actually the thing that matters to the victory points is Squire needs to nip round and drop a letter in this pile of dog poo. Like, there's a sort of like, there's a question of like, is the player paying attention to the actual victory conditions, or are they paying attention to their sort of aggressive assessment of the combat? And then when you're thinking about your first turn response and somebody swings round and the first thing they do is a sort of victory point non-aggression thing, and you're like, oh crumbs, I didn't see that, I thought you were going to do something else.
It's tricky, because I think it's one of the things where if you see through that to the victory conditions of a given scenario, and the game's interest is reliant on people not seeing through to that, the people who see through to it, it becomes very transparent and very, very solvable.
Yes, and the people like me who aren't really paying attention to that stuff will just lose.
Gentle viewer / listener, Mike and myself very, very recently played a game where the only way I would have a perfect victory was if Mike was more interested in smashing something with a hammer than tactically engaging with the game. And so I knew the game was an absolute guaranteed lock for me, because
from the first reading of the objective,
there was no possibility Mike wasn't going to hit me with the hammer and lose the game.
I liked the hammer. It had a very smooth and pleasant handle to the feeling in my hand. It swung nicely.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things is one of the interesting but really hard to design things is building in sort of hidden objectives and hidden aims, so that the random thing this person runs off and does, rather than the really obvious important thing, is actually way more important than the obviously important thing. And in theory, if people can bluff each other out and go over and do something random that actually is something random and distract you from the important thing, there's a lovely level of engagement there. But it's really hard to actually put that in a way that players... There's no point me bluffing something if you don't know what I'm bluffing. There's no point me running over there to do something and it's a bluff if you have the option of just thinking idiot and then going and doing the other thing. So if you're going to do that, you have to sort of build in signs and triggers and reminders to people that could be a bluff. It's really hard to pull off just feigns, in tabletop games, because you can just consider the other person an idiot and not take the bait. And so if you want to build in the idea that other things other than the obvious things are important to people who have really engaged with the game, you've got to build a lot of structures to do that, and a lot of ways of achieving it, and giving people help to lay out decoys and things of that nature. But
yeah,
you can pull that off.
Yeah, I mean, and just to bring that back, like all of that is in the direction of, can you provide 3 or 5 equally obvious first moves rather than it just being sledgehammer, where is coconut?
Yeah. And how many of the obvious moves can you hide from one player or the other? Because again, if it's 5 options that are all calculable, then somebody's going to do the calculations and it ceases to actually be tricky. If there's numbers attached, I can figure those numbers out. If some of it is legitimately hidden information from me, I don't know which of those 3 things actually matters to you, but I know that one of those 3 things matters to you, and I don't know which of your guys moving out are actually going to achieve it or not, then we've got a party. Then we've got something going on. But then you have to sort of carefully lay out the different objectives, and then everyone's got to have different sets of hidden objectives, and then everybody's got to have enough things to be able to possibly risk wasting somebody in order to bluff achieving the hidden objective. And then that's a whole design ball of wax that is a difficult and surgically precise thing to get right, and can fall horribly flat an awful lot of the time.
Probably do one of those other 4 things.
Yeah, if you can shoot for the moon and get that one right, then you've got the world in your hand. If you can't, just let people do passes and move on to something else, and try and find another bit of your game to make the shiny dingle.
Yeah. And the only other comment is, oh my goodness, summoning options. Those factions that can summon models and therefore increase their activation advantage. Be very careful.
Yes. Watch out for it. Be aware of this. It is a problem. You know, alternating activation is not a free sweetie and not the inevitable crusher of all IGO-UGO systems. And know that if you get this wrong, your game will be very easily and quickly soluble by certain players and incredibly unfun for certain other players. Right. That was a lovely little chat. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you for watching, if indeed you still are. And if you are, please do like and subscribe. And drop us a comment in the comment sections. What's your favorite solution to alternating activations in asymmetrical systems as a problem? When have you experienced a game that just doesn't bother fixing it for you and had a really unpleasant experience as your little elite force just gets run around by a swathe of goblins and you can do absolutely nothing about it? How do you like to see these problems solved in games generally? Is there a design of your own where this has popped up as a problem and you're struggling to fix it? Any and all of these things, please do drop into the comment section or hit us up directly on social media. We're generally about. But for now, I think it's going to be thank you and goodbye on this episode of Rule of Carnage. So we'll say thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.